Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today we got some more actual history for you from this book right here, Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This book was published all the way back in 1871. So this is episode 4 in my series on Fanny Kelly, and in this episode, Fanny is taken further into the Wyoming wilderness, where she finds herself in a perilous situation. To take up the thread of my own narrative again and the continuation of my journey with the Indians after the never-to-be-forgotten night when I parted with little Mary and the attempt to escape myself will be to entertain my reader with a sight of the dangerous and precipitous paths among the great bluffs with which we had been approaching, and the dizzy, fearful heights leading over the dark abyss, or the gloomy, terrible gorge where only an Indian dares to venture. The blackness of night and the dread of our Indian companions added terror to this perilous ride. As we passed the little creek before we plunged into these rocky fastnesses, we had left some scattered woods along its banks. I remember looking longingly at the dim shelter of these friendly trees, and being possessed by an almost uncontrollable desire to leap from my horse and dare my fate in endeavoring to reach their protecting shade. But the Indians' rifles behind me and my dread of instant death restrained me. And now my attention was attracted by the wild and terrible scenery around us, through which our fearful captors rode at ease, although it seemed impossible for man or beast to retain a footing over such craggy peaks and through such rugged ravines. The cool air and the sound of rippling water warned us of our nearness to a river, and soon the Indians turned their horses down a steep declivity that like a mighty wall closed in the great bed of the North Platte. I saw that the river was rapid and deep, but we crossed the sands, plunged in, and braved the current. From my child to my husband was an easy transition. Indeed, when I thought of one, the other was present in my mind, and to mark the path of our retreat with the letters and papers I dropped on our way seemed to be the only hope I had of his being able to come to my rescue. As the horses plunged into the swelling river, I secretly dropped another letter that I prayed might be a clue to the labyrinth through which we were being led, for I could see by all the Indians' precautions that to mislead anyone who should have the temerity to attempt our recovery was the design of their movements. They had taken paths inaccessible to white men, and they made their crossing at a point where it would be impossible for wagon trains to pass, so that they might avoid meeting immigrants. Having reached the opposite bank, they separated into squads and started in every direction except southward, so as to mislead or confuse pursuers by the various trails. The band that surrounded and directed us kept to the northward a little by the west. I tried to keep the points of compass clearly because it seemed part of the hope that sustained me. My husband had said that our position on the Little Box Elder was about 12 miles from Deer Creek Station, which lay to the northwest of us. Marking our present course, I tried by calculating the distance to keep that position in my mind, for toward it my yearning desire for help and relief turned. After crossing the river and issuing from the bluffs, we came to a bright, cool stream of water in a lovely valley, which ran through its bosom, spreading a delicious freshness all around. Brilliant flowers opened their gorgeous cups to the coming sunshine, and delicate blossoms hid themselves among the rich shrubbery and at the mossy roots of grand old trees. The awakening birds soared upward with loud and joyful melodies, and nature rejoiced at approaching day. The beauty and loveliness of the scene mocked my sleepless eyes, and despair tugged at my heartstrings. Still, I made superhuman efforts to appear cheerful, for my only refuge was in being submissive and practicing conciliation. My fear of them was too powerful to allow me to give way to emotion for one moment. There were sentinels stationed at different places to give the alarm, in case of anyone approaching to rescue us, and I afterward learned that in such a case I would have been instantly murdered. The next morning I learned by signs that Indians had gone out in search of little Mary, scattering themselves over the hills in squads. Those remaining were constantly overlooking their plunder and unrolling bundles taken from our wagons. They indulged their admiration for their spoils in loud conversation. The Indians seemed to select, with a clear knowledge of natural beauty, such localities as seemed best fitted to suggest refreshment and repose. The scenery through which we had passed was wildly grand. It now became serenely beautiful, and to a lover of nature with a mind free from fear and anxiety, the whole picture would have been a dream of delight. The night of my capture, I was ordered to lie down on the ground near a wounded Indian. A circle of them guarded me, and 3 fierce warriors sat near me with drawn tomahawks. Reader, imagine my feelings after the terrible scenes of the day previous. The desolate white woman in the power of revengeful Indians, not daring to speak lest their fury should fall on my defenseless head. My great anxiety now was to preserve my sanity, which threatened to be overcome if I did not arouse myself to hope, and put aside the feeling of despair which at times stole over me. My heart was continually lifted to our Father, and confidently I now began to feel that prayer would be answered, and that God would deliver me in due season. This nerved me to endure and appear submissive. At early dawn I was aroused from my apparent slumbers by the war chief, who sent me out to catch the horses. Our American horses were afraid of the Indians, and it was supposed that I could catch them readily. Upon returning, my eyes were gladdened by the sight of my fellow prisoner, who was seated with her boy upon the ground, eating buffalo meat and crackers. I went immediately to her, and we conversed in low tones, telling her of my intention to escape at the first opportunity. She seemed very much depressed, but I endeavored to reassure her, and bidding her hope for the best, went back to where the Indians were making ropes and packing their goods and plunder more securely, preparatory to the succeeding march, which was commenced at an early hour of the day. We proceeded on our journey until near noon, when we halted in a valley not far to the north of Deer Creek Station, and I met Mrs. Larimer again. It was a clear and beautiful valley where we rested, until the scorching rays of the sun had faded in the horizon. I was burdened with carrying the gun and bow and arrow of the chief, so my tired arms were relieved, and I pled for the privilege of camping here all night for many reasons. One reason was that we might be overtaken by friends sent to rescue us, and the distance of return would be less if I should be successful in my next attempt to escape. However, my entreaties were unavailing. The Indians were determined to go forward, and we were soon mounted and started on. We traveled until sunset. Then we camped for the night in a secluded valley. We seemed to enter this valley along the base of a wall composed of bluffs or peaks. Within these circling hills it lay, a green, cool resting place, watered by a bright sparkling stream and pleasantly dotted with bushes and undergrowth. The moon went down early, and in the dim, uncertain starlight, the heavy bluffs seemed to shut us in on all sides, rising grimly like guardians over our imprisoned lines. Blankets were spread, and on these the Indians rested. I was then led out some distance in the camp and securely fastened for the night. But before this I remarked to Mrs. Larimer my determination to escape that night, if my life were forfeit, as in every wind I fancied I could hear the voice of little Mary calling me. She entreated me not to leave her, but promising help to her should I be fortunate enough to get free, I sadly bade her good night, and went to my allotted place. In the morning, when I was permitted to rise, I learned that Mrs. Larimer and her child had disappeared. A terrible sense of isolation closed around me. No one can realize the sensation without in some measure experiencing it. I was desolate before, but now that I knew myself separated from my only white companion, the feeling increased tenfold, and seemed to weigh me down with its awful gloomy horror. In the heart of the wilderness, surrounded by creatures with whom no chord of sympathy was entertained, far from home, friends, and the interests of civilized life, the attractions of society, and above all else separated from my husband and loved ones, there seemed but one glimpse of light in all that blackness of despair, and that was flight. I listened to every sound while moments appeared hours, and it seemed to me that death in its most terrible form would not be so hard to bear as the torturing agony I then endured. I murmured broken prayers. I seemed to hear the voices of my husband and child calling me, and springing forward with a wild belief that it was real, would sink back again, overwhelmed with fresh agony. Arrangements were then made for resuming our journey, and we were soon once more on the march. Another burden had been added to my almost worn-out frame, the leading of an unruly horse, and my arms were so full of the implements I was forced to carry that I threw away the pipe of the old chief, a tube nearly 3 feet long, and given me to take care of, which was very unfortunate for me, exciting the wrath and anger of the chief to a terrible degree. Now they seemed to regard me with a suspicious aversion, and were not so kind as before. The country they passed over was high, dry, and barren. I rode one horse and led another, and when evening came they stopped to rest in a grove of great timber, where there was a dry creek bed. Water was obtained by digging in the sand, but the supply was very meager, and I was allowed none. The sun began to sink, and the chief was so enraged against me that he told me by signs that I should behold it rise no more. Grinding his teeth with wrathful anger, he made me understand that I was not to be trusted, had once tried to escape, had made them suffer the loss of my child, and that my life would now be forfeit. A large fire was built, and they danced all around it. Night had begun to darken heavily over me, and I stood trembling and horror-struck, not knowing but that the flame the Indians capered about was destined to consume my tortured form. The pipe of the chief was nowhere to be found, and it was demanded of me to produce it. He used the Indian words uttered in a voice of thunder, accompanying them with wild gestures, whose meaning was too threatening to be mistaken. I looked in fear and dismay around me, utterly at a loss to know what was expected, yet dreading the consequences of failing to obey. Wakela, the Indian boy who had been so kind to me, now came up and made the motion of puffing with his lips to help me, and then I remembered that I had broken the pipe the day before and thrown it away, ignorant of their veneration for the pipe and of its value as a peace offering. The chief declared that I should die for having caused the loss of his pipe. An untamed horse was brought, and they told me I would be placed on it as a target for their deadliest arrows, and the animal might then run at will, carrying my body where it would. Helpless and almost dying with terror at my situation, I sank on a rocky seat in their midst. They were all armed, and anxiously awaited the signal. They had pistols, bows, and spears, and I noticed some stoop and raise blazing firebrands to frighten the pawing beast that was to bear me to death. In speechless agony I raised my soul to God. Soon it would stand before his throne. With all the pleading passion of my sinking soul I prayed for pardon and favor in his precious blood, who had suffered for my sins and risen on high for my justification. In an instant, a lifetime of thought condensed itself into my mind, and I could see my old home and hear my mother's voice, and the contrast between the love I had been so ruthlessly torn from and the hundreds of Indian faces gleaming with ferocity and excitement around me seemed like the lights and shadows of some weird picture. But I was now to die, and I desired with all the strength of my soul to grasp the promises of God's mercy and free my parting spirit from all revengeful earthly thoughts. In what I almost felt my final breath, I prayed for my own salvation and the forgiveness of my enemies, and remembering a purse of money which was in my pocket, knowing that it would decay with my body in the wilderness, I drew it out and, with suffused eyes, divided it among them, though my hands were growing powerless and my sight failing. $120 in notes I gave them, telling them its value as I did so, when, to my astonishment, a change came over their faces. They laid their weapons on the ground, seemingly pleased, and anxious to understand, requesting me to explain the worth of each note clearly by holding up my fingers. Eagerly I tried to obey, perceiving the hope that their milder manner held out, but my cold hands fell powerless to my side, my tongue refused to utter a sound, and unconsciously I sank to the ground, utterly insensible to objects around me. When insensibility gave way to returning feeling, I was still on the ground where I had fallen, but preparations for the deadly scene were gone, and the Indians slumbered on the ground nearby me by the faint firelight. Crawling into a sitting posture, I surveyed the camp, and saw hundreds of sleeping forms lying in groups around, with watches set in their places and no opportunity to escape, even if strength permitted. Weak and trembling, I sank down and lay silent till daybreak, when the camp was again put in motion, and at their bidding I mounted one horse and led another, as I had done on the day previous. This was no easy task, for the pack horse, which had not been broken, would frequently pull back so violently as to bring me to the ground, at which the chief would become fearfully angry, threatening to kill me at once. Practicing great caution and using strong effort, I would strive to remain in the saddle to avoid the cuffs and blows received. Whenever the bridle would slip inadvertently from my hand, the chief's blasphemous language would all be English, a sad commentary on the benefits white men confer on their Indian brethren when brought into close contact. Drunkenness, profanity, and dissolute habits are the lessons of civilization to the Indians, and when the weapons we furnish are turned against ourselves, their edge is keen indeed. Feeling that I had forfeited the goodwill of the Indians, and knowing that the tenure of my life was most uncertain, I dared make no complaint, although hunger and devouring thirst tortured me. The way still led through dry and sandy hills, upon which the sun glared down with exhausting heat, and seemed to scorch life and moisture out of all below. As far as my eye could reach, nothing but burning sand and withering sagebrush or thorny cactus was to be seen. All my surroundings only served to aggravate the thirst, which the terrible heat of that long day's ride increased to a frenzy. When, in famishing despair, I closed my eyes, a cup of cool, delicious drink would seem to be presented to my lips, only to be cruelly withdrawn, and this torture seemed to me like the agony of the rich man who besought Lazarus for one drop of water to cool his parched tongue. I thought of all I had been separated from, as it seemed to me, forever, and the torment of the hour reduced me to despair. I wished to die, feeling that the pangs of dissolution could not surpass the anguish of my living death. My voice was almost gone, and with difficulty I maintained my seat in the saddle. Turning my eyes despairingly to my captors, I uttered the word mine, signifying water in their language, and I kept repeating it imploringly at intervals. They seemed to hurry forward, and just as the sun set, we came in sight of a grassy valley through which flowed a river, and the sight of it came like hope to my almost dying eyes. A little brook from the hills above found its way into the waters of this greater stream, and here they dismounted, and lifting me from my horse, laid me in its shallow bed. I had become almost unconscious, and the cool, delightful element revived me. At first I was not able to drink, but gradually my strength renewed itself, and I found relief from the indescribable pangs of thirst. The stream by which the Indians camped that night was Powder River, and here in 1866 Fort Connor was built, which in the following year was named Fort Reno. So that's it for this episode. Here Fanny Kelly was condemned to die by the chief because she lost his pipe, but she was saved when she pulled out the $120 that she had. We also learned that Sarah Larimer and her boy had disappeared, so in the next episode in this series we'll hear from Mrs. Larimer about her account of these events following their capture. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.